Thursday, April 11th, 2019, Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. Today I'm going to dispel the myth that you can only have hyperinflation in places like Venezuela, which is supposedly socialist or communist, supposedly has a dictator, authoritarian government. And I'll use my experience partly from growing up in Brazil. Many of you might not know I grew up in Brazil, and show you that it can happen anywhere, and it could happen in the United States. It could happen here in Britain. It doesn't really matter. All you need really is a fiat currency that is managed by a central bank and the government together. So a system, centralized system. Before that, of course, I'll look at what the markets are doing this morning. It's just before 8 a.m. London. Yesterday was a fairly quiet day in the markets. So I'll just start looking and see what's happening this morning. So gold yesterday continued to trade a little higher. Of course, it always seems to be under tight control. The powers that be seem to have control of the price of gold for the moment. We've got spot gold right now at 1306.50. That's down $1.40. The high has been just under 1310 as well, and it's always pretty much the same. Like, you have a good day prior, like yesterday, and then the next day overnight they make sure it doesn't get through the highs of yesterday. It just shows that it's a managed market. In the random market, those things wouldn't happen. Right now, spot silver is 15.20, down a cent and a half. Range has been 15.19 to 15.28. So yeah, they're firmer a little bit, especially gold. But I would say sentiment is still pretty negative because we're not getting any really big moves higher. The Dow right now is basically unchanged, down 1.5 points, which is nothing. The Dow future 26,158. S&P is up 2 points, 28.90. The Nasdaq 100 future is up 6 at 76.18. I noticed the Nasdaq did well yesterday, so that was the only part of the stock market really that performed fairly well. I think it was up just under 1%. The pound is at 130.83, down about 6 pips, so virtually unchanged. The euro as well is at 120.76. So fairly quiet this morning. The dollar is up 0.1% against the yen, Japanese yen, at 111.15, and basically unchanged against the yuan at 672.15. What about the energy market or crude oil? WTI is at 64.30. That's down 0.5%. So it's still holding on fairly well. It's kind of stabilized at the moment in the last few days. Brent is at 71.25, down 0.4%. I've noticed the bond market has rallied slightly in the last few days, even though we haven't gone anywhere. The 10-year yield right now is back below 2.5%. It's at 2.48. The 3-month the 3-month T-bill yield is at 2.42, and the 7 years at 2.38. So still inverted there by 4 basis points. Yesterday we had the CPI, which is a measure the powers that be economists use to tell people that there's no inflation. CPI is only a measure of prices. We know that inflation is a monetary phenomenon, and we've had tons of inflation for the last 47 years since, or 48 years since Richard Nixon closed the gold window. And even before that, we had inflation in the late 60s, early 70s. So CPI yesterday came out at 1.9%. which is near this 2% that the Fed says they need to have. I read something by Christopher Whalen, Whalen. He actually did work for the New York Fed, I think, early in his career. He's a bank analyst, and he knows what he's talking about. And he said that there's nothing in the, I think it's the Humphrey-Hawkins law that was passed in 1980 or thereabouts, to set the goals for the Fed of low employment and stable prices. And it said nothing about 2% in that. It says that inflation should be 0. So that's another fallacy as well. And we know that prices are rising a lot more than that 1.9% or 2%. We just need to look at how John Williams looks at it at shadowstats.com. He takes the way they used to calculate CPI back in the 90s, 1980s. It's more like 6 or 8%. So in real terms, bond yields are actually negative right now. I know the interest rates are not negative, but if you take the real rise in cost of living of 6, 7, or 8%, and you only got a 10-year yield at 2.5%, it's actually -6. So savers are being screwed, and they're going to continue to be screwed for the foreseeable future. And when people say there's no inflation, I'm sorry, that's just that's not very truthful, I would say. Core CPI, which excludes almost everything, that one was 2%, and it was expected 2.1%. I think the market focuses on that. Anyway, hyperinflation and how it can happen anywhere. And you need to understand, even though this video is more about the fact that it can happen anywhere, what hyperinflation is. Hyperinflation is not when normal CPI, I hate to say CPI, but that's what people use. It's not when normal CPI or prices rise and then pick up. No, it's when confidence in the fiat currency, people lose complete confidence in that fiat currency, and they just demand for that currency goes down the tubes. And what do I mean, demand for it? Well, it means that whenever you receive that currency, you try to get rid of it as much as possible. So the supply of it will increase, and everything but the supply of other real things are fixed. So that leads to the complete loss of confidence and value in that currency. So that's what hyperinflation is. It's not related to cost push inflation, as it's called. So Brazil, and the reason I'm doing this is to warn people that just because you think the United States is not socialist, or the UK right now has a conservative government, it doesn't mean that we can't have hyperinflation. So Brazil, for example, where I was born in 1964, and you can see here on Wikipedia, 1964 was the year where there was a military coup in April of 1964, and a military regime took over. It says here 1964 Brazilian coup d'etat. You can maybe Google this and read it yourself, the whole thing, but I'm just gonna give you some of the details of it. It says here, the coup brought to Brazil a military regime politically aligned to the interests of the United States government. Well, yeah, there are many people that think the CIA was involved in this coup, and they probably were. This regime lasted until 1985, when Tancredo Neves was indirectly elected the first civilian president of Brazil since the 1960 elections. So, well, the hyperinflation in Brazil happened in 1987. And even though by then my parents had, moved out of Brazil. I mean, I was what, 23, 22 back then. I knew, of course, what was going on economically, but I didn't know what I know now. But my father, well, his business was foreign based, so we did okay because he earned a lot of his revenues were in U.S. dollars, and the U.S. dollar, even though it was a fiat money then, compared to the local currency, it was like almost as good as gold, so to speak. But so what does it say here on Wikipedia? Well, they're talking about the return to power of civilian government or democracy. You see, democracy came back. It says civilians returned to power in 1985 when Sarney assumed the presidency. He became unpopular during his tenure through failure to control the economic crisis and hyperinflation he inherited from the military regime. So now we've got a supposedly right-wing, pro-military president, Bolsonaro. I think he even, because as you see, the military coup was in April, wasn't it? March 31st to April 1st in 1964. So I read that recently he even commemorated that with parts of the military. So here's a guy who's he's elected president now, and he commemorates a military regime that led to hyperinflation. And then he's having a go at Venezuela that they're socialist and they've got hyperinflation, right? So yes, I would say Brazil, the people in Brazil are used to these crises. So it wasn't the end of the world. Interesting thing that happened was with my uncle, who's a doctor. He's still alive, and I think he's still practicing. He's like in his 80s, but he had just bought a house near where he lived. And in Brazil, near Rio, people live in apartments a lot. There's not too many houses, how there's more apartment blocks. He lived in an apartment, but he bought a house near where he lived for a new medical practice that he wanted to open. So, bought the house. And then I heard from my parents, and they told me that the person who sold the house to my uncle, when they completed the transaction, it was the day before the currency collapsed and they brought in a new currency. So unfortunately for the man who sold the house to my uncle, the money he received from my uncle the day before became worth fractions in purchasing power what it was worth the day before. So my uncle was very lucky there that he was able to do that. So that's what happens in the hyperinflation. So the other thing I want to point out, because I said that you need centralized government, central banking to have a hyperinflation. I found a year or two ago, and I've never looked into this, that the Central Bank of Brazil was actually established on December 31st, 1964. You can see here that year again, 1964, and it says, the military coup, the military coup was fomented by the CIA, and you have to wonder whether the guy that they deposed in Brazil in 1964, whether he was against having a central bank. But there you go. It's not because of socialism. It's because of central banking and the over-issuance of currency. I mean, you look at Venezuela now, for example, its debt to GDP is fairly low. And I'm taking this from trading economics. It's actually very low. It's more near 20% of GDP then over 100% like the US. But the problem they've been having is that their economy, through sanctions, they've been, the Americans and the have cut them off of their supply of dollars. And without dollars at the moment, you can't function in the international economy. So they've had to, they've had a tough time, and they're running huge budget deficits to keep things going. You can see their budget deficits are running in double digits. Sounds familiar? You know, the $1 trillion plus budget deficit in the US. I know it's not to double digits yet, but it's like 5-6%. Hyperinflation, fiscal irresponsibility. It's not, you know, don't be fooled. Just keep an eye on the numbers. Don't let, you know, the mainstream media or the mainstream economists tell you it's a socialist thing. I'm not trying to defend socialism. I'm just trying to tell you it can happen in any political system. US, UK, Brazil, Venezuela, Weimar, Germany, anywhere. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button. If you enjoy my videos but haven't subscribed, think about subscribing. If you think other people might enjoy this kind of content, make sure you share it. Don't forget to hit the little notification bell above to be notified of my new videos. And you can also follow me on Twitter, Steemit, and on DTube. I wish you all a great day. Take care. Bye.